Well, all is peaceful in Hadfield train station at the moment, it seems. And we're starting our journey today from Hadfield train station because it's been here for many, many moons. But maybe for people who live in this area, you might not know that in this particular section, well, Hadfield, Padfield, Tintwistle, many of the reservoirs were filled with mills at one point. So I thought we've got to do an episode about the mills. So today we'll walk from Hadfield train station down to where the bridge is. We'll walk down Station Road, cross over the roundabout where the new lamp inn is, and then head to where the bridge is, as if you passed from Hadfield to Tintwistle, up towards Pixies and New Road. We'll stop at the bridge there where the River Etherow crosses. I've got a great guest today because I have to say, I don't know much about mills, but like I've said in previous episodes, what Kate Raine doesn't know about mills in this area, it's just not worth knowing. I think your middle name should be Mill, Kate Mill Raine.
Thank you very much.
Right, well, shall we start walking? And Kate, you are one of the people who is at Glossop Heritage Trust. And I have to say, this is a passion, isn't it? It's not necessarily something you even get paid for. Is that right?
Yes, the trust is entirely voluntary run, and our passion is telling people about the history of places so they can make a real connection to the place where they live and help to build a community by knowing about their past.
Yeah, and we met Roger the other day. He loves to geek out on the tracks and the traffic and all that side of things. We met Tim yesterday. He was talking about some of the archaeology and the stonemason marking, but another big part of the history here is mills. And as we come to the main kind of turning point in Hadfield, where we've got the Palatine pub, we've got Hadfield Hall, D&D newsagents. I mean, I have a map in my hand which is dated 1907 or a 1910 edition, I think it says. If it was a lot of change in 3 years, I guess there probably was at this time.
Was, yes.
And even at this point, there were many different mills in this area. I mean, Station Mill, where Malvern Rise is now, that's a fairly newish housing estate. Can you kind of tell us about some of the families that would have lived in around Hadfield, Padfield at this time?
So in Hadfield and Padfield in 1907, you had Station Mills, as you've just mentioned. That was owned by the Platts family. So they were big philanthropists in the area. Across the road, they built, as we can see in front of us, Hadfield Hall.
I know, and yeah, they donated it to the community, didn't they? So they could have a reading room,
yes,
which is brilliant
and
for the people.
And a public assembly room.
Yeah.
So lots of celebrations have gone on in the hall, and coronations and other celebrations.
I mean, it's the day that they kind of, I saw some black and white photos when the War Memorial was, I don't know what the exact word is, was officially opened.
Dedicated, yeah.
That's it. That's it. I knew you'd know the word. And this area was absolutely packed, and even on Memorial Day, on Remembrance Day these days, there are still hundreds of people who come here with a brass band. So the Platt family, big players in this particular area.
Yes, they definitely were, and they lived at Merseybank, yep, which is now a nursing home. Oh. But at times of celebration, they would have the community into their home. The school children would come to a tea party. They would set out teas in normally St Andrew's schoolroom. So big philanthropists.
Wow. And this whole area of Station Road was completely different. I mean, I live fairly near this bit, and the photos I've seen have been of trams running up and down Station Road, I guess, to collect the people to go to work.
Yeah, so the tram system was set up in 1903, and it ran from Old Glossop right down at Glossop High Street, past Dinting Printworks and up Woolly Bridge into Hadfield.
Oh, if only we could have that now. It'd be brilliant, wouldn't it?
It wasn't very successful in its day, though, because obviously with all the hills in Glossop, the buses did a much better job.
Yeah. Now, this particular road obviously had so many different shops. I mean, even now, some of the shops we've got today, the post office, the Twig coffee shop, one of my favourites, the bakery, Boots, Brigadoon, opticians. But there was so many things happening on here. I mean, the butcher's, which has now closed, was here in the very early days, wasn't it? And I understand the bakery, when I looked into, was a printer's. So why would you have a printers on a main road? It's just fascinating.
This really was the commercial hub of the village or town. This is where everyone got their supplies. There was hundreds of people working in the mills around here, so obviously they needed everything that, instead of walking all the way to Glossop.
oh, the greyhound saying hello very happily. The map I have here, which I went and dug out last night, because myself and Tim, if you haven't listened to yesterday's episode, we went on a bit of a wander down Station Road, turned off at Lamgates, round where the back of like a little brook is, and walked through Roughfields and across Hadfield Main Road. And we wandered down the back of Lamgates and we saw all these kind of fence posts, but we couldn't work out what they were. And so I dug out a map that was donated to me by someone of this 1907, version of Hadfield. And there I realised that the bits that we were looking at yesterday was part of another mill, White Mill. Who would have thought it? And it's got a little mill pond, and I mean, it seems very small compared to the fact that there were much bigger ones all around, although it does say disused.
Yeah, so
even then.
In the late 18th century is when the mills first started appearing in this area. One of the earliest was Brookside, which we'll come to later. Yeah. So they processed woolen cloth at first, and it was only in the early 19th century that they started converting to cotton. But at that time, the power was still either by water wheels, so we didn't have the big kind of steam power from the engines that later on. So the original mills were all quite small, so we're talking about the 1820s here, early 19th century, and White Mill was one such mill, I think, built by the Thornleys, who we will also come to later. But by the time some of the bigger mills started being established after the introduction of steam power, the smaller ones just got disused.
Right. Gosh. Okay. So there was obviously, Station Mill. It actually says here it was a cotton mill. The people kind of living around here. I mean, my house we think dates back to 1892, just up one of these streets. So the expansion of Hadfield and this area must have just blown up since 1830, 1840?
So the original centre of the village of Hadfield would have been near where the old cross is now, where Hadfield Old Hall is.
We've just walked past the turning for it, Kiln Lane, so we've just passed Tesco, and the turning up there takes you to where the cross isn't there anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah, so that date has a date stone on it of 1646, if I'm correct.
Oh, you know what? Yeah, that's it.
So that was the village. So it was just centred around that bit. So after the mills started coming up, especially when they had their big expansion between the 1830s to 1860s, this is when the town of Hadfield, as we know now, started really expanding, and that's why many of the buildings are 1890s, late 19th century terraced housing.
See, I'm just going to cross over the road if it is safe to do so. Yes, it is. On the corner of a turning called Osborne Place, there is actually a date stone here, and this looks like it's one of the early ones, because I'm sure it says 1855.
It does.
There we go. Osborne Place, 1855. So that gives a bit of a sense. So let's kind of move to some of the bigger mills then. We're going to be turning eventually to go past the roundabout by the New Lamp Inn. Waterside Mill is the one that everyone seems to talk about. What happened there?
So Waterside Mill was the biggest mill, cotton spinning mill in the area.
When you say the area, do you mean bigger than Glossop, or just in this our little patch?
In Glossop Dale, so that is Hadfield, Glossop,
Come on, Hadfield.
Charlesworth, similarly.
Come on.
All of those. And it was also the longest living, so we think it's one of the earliest mills that was built, and it was also one of the last to close.
Gosh, okay. So Waterside was owned by who?
It had different owners throughout its history. It started off as a fulling mill, so processing woolen cloth. Yeah. That was in the 1760s. That's when it was called Brookside. Then a bit later on, probably around the 1780s, it was purchased by two gentlemen called John Thornley and John Turner.
Hang on a sec, I recognise their names. I think I recognise their names from a bit further downstream.
Yes.
Okay.
So they owned several mills in the area, and some of those no longer exist, or the buildings don't exist because they're underneath the reservoir.
Okay, so I think I know where you're going. So many people, I suppose, know about Valehouse Reservoir, the fact that there was a mill town there and it was flooded, and I'm guessing that they had something to do with that.
They sure did.
Did they build it? Did they run it? What did they do?
They built it. And they ran it until they went bankrupt in 1824.
Right, so when it actually got flooded, was it in use then?
It was still it just about stopped being in use because they didn't convert to steam power, so they were still using the water wheel, so it wasn't economically viable.
Right. If you don't keep up with the times, you're not staying in business. So it's worth just kind of touching on Valehouse for 1 second, because a lot of people have heard about the Whispering Chimney and the myth of this Whispering Chimney. Apparently, when the reservoirs were flooded, the only bit that remained was this huge chimney that stuck out from the water. And I understand that eventually it had to get knocked down, because when people were getting the train on the Woodhead line through to Sheffield, they were all going on one side of the carriage, and that the train company was scared that the train would tip over. Yeah, so they asked for it to be demolished.
That is the story. See, the chimney was close to people's heart, and Valehouse was a town in itself, a village in itself. There were several hundred workers that worked there. So they had their own pub, they had their own school, they had their own church. They lived in the houses down there because it was quite far from Tintwistle. Even in the baptism registers, people are recorded as being born there as a village in its own right. So when the mill closed down when it was flooded in 1869, the people had quite an attachment to it, so they sent in a petition that the mill chimney should remain, so that's why it wasn't knocked down at the time.
Right. And I understand when it was windy, people could hear it whistling as well.
Yeah, the wind blew through and made all kinds of kind of whispering, kind of whistling sounds.
Yeah, like the ghosts of the valley or something, I suppose. Right, well, we have crossed over. We're walking crossed over where the roundabout is, the new lap in. We're walking down Waterside, and in fact, why don't we just cross over whilst it's quiet? It gets quite busy, this road, so if you're walking, listening to us, make sure you're careful with the traffic. So here now, where Waterside Mill would have been, is just an industrial estate. You know, it's very used. There's lots and lots of different companies. There's gyms, there's car garages, and there is a sign, I think, a little bit further down for the Hadfield and Padfield Heritage Trail. I mean, there were so many children that worked at this mill, is what the board says, and they died. Many people died here. It was a dangerous place to work.
Mills was a very dangerous place to work. A lot of the children would have been crawling underneath machinery to connect the threads together and doing some very dangerous jobs. But as time moved on and conditions improved and laws were passed, that children had to go to school till a certain age. But even still, towards the end of the 19th century, children were beginning in the mills at the age of 10 as standard. There was a lovely article I found in a newspaper about a lady that retired from Hearst Mill in, I think, about 1948, and she'd she'd worked in the mills from the age of 10, so she started in the 1890s.
Wow.
And she'd worked from the mills all her life.
Gosh.
Starting off in some of the mills up here, I think she started off in Hadfield Mill, in Hadfield.
Goodness me. Now, am I right in thinking somewhere on the other side of the road there's a flag blowing over on the other side? Did one of the mill owners have like a significant house over here, I was trying to read, or one of the families who ran this mill?
So this mill, after Thornleys and Turner were running the mill, when John Thornton died in 1790, Turner brought the Thornley family out, so he was running the mill by himself. And then when he died, his son William carried on the mill until about the 1820s. And in 1820 we have the major family that was in this mill, the Sidebottom family.
Yes.
So they had owned mills in Broadbottom.
Yep.
And they also were starting mills in Hollingsworth, so they lived at Millbrook House.
Okay, which is just on the Woodhead Pass, or Manchester Road. What was it? The Manchester to Saltersbrook Turnpike,
yes.
As it was known then, I guess.
But then one of the sons came out here in 1820 and purchased the mill from William Turner, and that's when this mill really started expanding. It was quite small towards that point. So then they really moved over to kind of cotton spinning and weaving in a big way because they introduced the steam engine.
Ah, okay. And was it one of the Sidebottoms that lived in this area then? I think I recognise that name.
So yeah, the Sidebottoms lived in the family that lived in this area. One of the brothers had a house within the site,
right.
And then they were living in some of the big houses around. But the Sidebottom is one of the major mill owning families around, not just here but in Glossop as well. Wow. So they rapidly expanded the site from the 1820s well into the 1860s. They were still building new mills, so the complex was made up of lots of different mill buildings. So they were producing calico that was then being transported down to Dinting Printworks, where they were printing all the lovely patterns onto it in Edmund's Potter's factory, which were then being sold.
So is calico basically like a type of ink?
Calico is the cotton. It's the weave of the cotton.
And so then Edmund Potter, grandfather of Beatrix Potter, and people may not know that, was pretty much the daddy in dinting, let's put it nicely that way. And the stuff that they were printing, was it like patterned shirts or patterned skirts, or what kind of stuff were they doing?
So it was dress fabric, so fabric that was going to be transported off and made into dresses, but they also did fabric for kind of curtains and upholstery.
It's amazing, isn't it? Because the textile industry, I think, there's been so many people who've worked in that kind of world over the years. I mean, as times went on, in kind of this, well, not this century actually, it's 23 years into a new century. In the 20th century, I love the idea that there were things like peanut butter, custard powder, cocoa, yan pickle, spam. It was all being made here. The smell of the area around here must have been mad.
Yes, it must have been bad from the production, but also it's very easy to forget just how smoky around here. The mills had massive chimneys that would have been churning out smoke, and because there were so many in the area, there would have been a smoky haze. And which you can see often in quite a lot of the old photographs where the background's not quite as clear as you would think.
Yeah, it's like the day when people used to smoke in pubs. Everything just had a haze in the air. I mean, it's saying here that during the Second World War, this particular mill produced fabric for parachutes and barrage balloons. I don't even know what barrage balloons is. Is it barrage? I don't know how to say that word. I'm just making it sound posh. Okay, I mean, yeah, that kind of gives a flavour, I suppose. There's so much more. You go into a lot more detail on your articles on the Glossop Heritage Trust website, and if people want to dig into that and really understand all the different chapters that went there. I mean, how did it end in the end?
So the Sidebottoms really made this mill the biggest in the area. But by 1890s, things were on a downturn. A lot of the family were second generation, and they were interested in local politics and even national politics, with some of them becoming MPs. Right. So the heart just wasn't in running the factory. And then with the downturn in the cotton industry as well, by the 1890s, things were coming to a halt. I think in 1899, in the 1890s, the mill was brought out by Gartsides and Company, and then later became part of the Calico Printers Association. So that was a consortium of lots of different mills and calico printing factories all over the UK.
Wow. I mean, it's amazing. Now we're going past a sign where, these days there's a bit of joinery, there's bodywork, there's roof specialists. I mean, that we're looking down into the industrial estate. There's lorries there. Well, there is another mill that we are coming up to, which I notice is on the map, which says Bridge Mill. And that came to not such a great end. Is maybe a way of putting it nicely. 1899, a fire broke out on the top of the mill. I've seen some of the black and white photos, and it was described as a tragedy for the village of Tintwistle. I couldn't work out whether people had died or what had happened, but I understand hundreds of people came to see as the mill collapsed. It took days for them to put the fire out and take it apart. It was deemed dangerous. I remember reading in one book, there were worries that people were trapped in the mill as well. But, I mean, who owned Bridge Mill? Who was that connected to?
So Bridge Mill was part of the Waterside complex. So all this big estate down to Hadfield. Two of the brothers owned this side of the mill, and the other brother owned the other side of the mill.
Oh dear!
But later on, it was all just under the company of Waterside Mills. So Bridge Mill, after the fire, there was not much left, so it wasn't included in the sale to Gartsides.
Right. Well, I mean, it's mad, isn't it, to think that all these people would have been walking here to work or getting the tram to work, and now we're just approaching the traffic lights for the bridge. The River Etherow flows through, and obviously one of the big reasons that the reservoirs were built was to get more water so the mills downstream could work.
Yeah, so the reservoirs were built to supply water to Manchester, drinking water. Yeah. But obviously all the mills that were along the River Etherow suddenly wouldn't have the water supply they were used to. Yeah. So the last two mills, Bottoms and Valehouse, are actually compensation reservoirs to ensure that the water still flows for all the mill owners.
Wow. And I mean, the water now, as we look at it, I mean, it looks pretty clean to me, there's not any strange colours and weird foamy bits on it. I hope not anyway, but back then there must have been dye from the cottons. I mean, was it like this romantic clean stream that we're thinking of?
Probably not. So there was bleaching processes and dyeing processes which caused all sorts of colours. There's a Longclough Brook in Glossop was also known as Chemmy Brook.
Wow, I mean, that's like chemical problems of the 19th century. I mean, this is a huge bridge. You imagine them building this, the size of the stones on this bridge. I mean, we're going to wrap up this particular walk today here. We could see Christchurch just on the hill in front, and we can't yet see the reservoirs because the steep bank kind of blocks it, but we could see people walking their dogs up the ramp. There are birds in front of us. we'll get into more about the Tintwistle side and along some more of the mills along Bottoms and into the reservoirs in another episode, do you think?
I think so.
We can't mill you out too much all in one go. But like I say, this is a fascinating bit of history, and whilst there's been lots of talk and research about the mills of Glossop, there is also that history out there for this side of town too, of Hadfield and Padfield. So do go and check out Glossop Heritage Trust website. I will pin some of the photos and some of the articles that I have access to on our map on longdendaletales.co.uk. In the meantime, I might turn away from the traffic. I might just gaze out this way towards the river. It's a pretty wide bank right now. You can just about hear it flowing, and all the brambles next to it, and the skips and the new houses. But hey, next time I'll be back on the reservoirs, in the wind, in the cold, and I hope that I remember both of my gloves. Have a great day. Bye bye.